The first time Sarah Veth saw the human soldier, she laughed. She was not alone in that. The entire garrison on the ridge above the valley laughed. A low, resonant sound that carried like the groan of tectonic plates, something more felt than heard, a vibration in the chest that the garrison's human translator described in his notes as contemptuous amusement. The soldier was standing in the clearing alone, without armor, without weapon, and what made them laugh was not his vulnerability. The garrison had seen vulnerable things before. What made them laugh was his face. Half of it was gone. Not literally gone, the flesh was still there, the bone beneath it still intact. But the left side of Sergeant Mace Keller's face had been rebuilt, surgically and imperfectly, by the field medics of the 14th Expeditionary, after a Veth proximity mine had removed the original architecture and left behind something that the medics' scarce supplies and limited time could only approximate. The reconstructive foam they'd used had cured wrong, setting in ridges and depressions that caught the light strangely, giving the left side of his face the texture of a planet seen from orbit, valleys, and highlands, craters, and ridges, while the right side remained perfectly, almost aggressively, ordinary. A dark eye, a jaw stubbled in 3 days of growth, a mouth that was doing nothing dramatic, just being a mouth. The garrison laughed because the Veth found asymmetry deeply, genuinely disturbing. In their biology, bilateral symmetry was not merely aesthetic, it was diagnostic. Asymmetry indicated disease, genetic corruption, the kind of systemic failure that preceded death. Their commanders had studied human faces extensively in the 6 years since first contact and had concluded, based on all available data, that humans found asymmetry equally repellent. The burned face before them, they believed, was a face its owner could not bear to look at. The garrison had expected the human delegation to send their best, their most imposing, their most symmetrically perfect, as all opening negotiations required. Instead, they had sent this, a man who, to Veth perception, was announcing his own biological failure. Mace Keller walked across the clearing with his hands at his sides and his scarred face tilted slightly, upward into the dawn sky, and the garrison laughed, and he let them. Colonel Hessa Vane watched him from the ridge through her field scope. She was 300 meters above and behind him, in the ruins of what had been a communications relay before the Veth flattened it, sitting on a chunk of concrete with her scope balanced on her knee. Her aide, Lieutenant Pryor, crouched beside her with a datapad open to Keller's personnel file. He knows what they're doing, Pryor said. Not a question. He asked for the briefing on Veth biology twice, Vane said. He knows exactly what he looks like to them. He asked to go. Pryor was quiet for a moment. Below, Keller had stopped in the center of the clearing. He stood with the relaxed stillness of someone who has been still in dangerous places many times, and has learned to be comfortable there. The Veth garrison's laughter was dying down, not because anything had stopped being funny, but because the contingent of senior observers was arriving from the command structure farther up the ridge, and senior observers required a certain performed composure from their subordinates. He asked to go, Pryor repeated, as if testing whether the words meant what he thought they meant. He wanted them to see his face. He wanted the opening 30 seconds of negotiations to be about something they couldn't quite figure out, Vane said. She lowered the scope. When you can't figure out what you're looking at, you can't be certain what you're dealing with. Uncertainty is the only leverage we have right now. Down in the clearing, the Veth delegation was moving to meet Keller. 7 figures, tall and angular, their carapaces the gray-blue of deep water, their locomotion something between walking and flowing. The Veth had 4 limbs but used them in combinations that human observers still found. Slightly nauseating to watch, a suggestion of articulation in joints that seemed to have more dimensions than physics strictly allowed. Their senior negotiator, the one Veth intelligence identified as Keth Salon, moved at the front. She was larger than the others, darker carapaced, and she wore what the translation teams had identified as ranking insignia. Geometric patterns etched directly into the outer shell, painful to acquire, permanent, a living record of authority. She had stopped laughing before the others. She was watching Keller with the flat, total attention of something that has just noticed the thing it's looking at is not what it appeared to be. Keller met her eyes, or the structures that serve that function, the wide, multifaceted optical clusters, set high in the facial carapace, and he nodded. It was a human gesture. The Veth had no equivalent. In 6 years of contact, the translation teams had not settled on a Veth analog for the nod. It meant, depending on your reading, acknowledgement, or respect, or simply, I see you. In Keth Salon's particular case, with her particular understanding of human military culture, she had cataloged the gesture as an expression of readiness. A soldier's nod before something begins. She had not been warned to expect it from a man with a ruined face. What happened next was not in the briefing either side had prepared. Mace Keller reached to the chest pocket of his field jacket and removed a small, flat object. He held it up so Keth Salon could see it clearly. It was a mirror, small, round, the kind of thing a person carries in their kit not out of vanity, but because a mirror is useful, for signaling, for checking corners, for looking at wounds you can't otherwise see. He held it up so the morning light caught it, so it flashed once, twice, like a signal to something very far away. Then he turned it to face himself. The garrison fell completely silent. There is a moment in every negotiation, the briefing materials said, when the other party reveals something about the nature of their thinking. The Veth were watching a creature with a catastrophically asymmetrical face hold a mirror up and look at itself without flinching, without horror, without any of the signals their biological database said it should be displaying. Keller's expression, reflected in the small circle of glass, was the same mild, steady thing it had been when he walked across the clearing. He looked at his own ruined face the way a carpenter looks at a tool, aware of it, unbothered by it, thinking already about the next thing. He lowered the mirror and put it back in his pocket. Keth Solon had not moved. "Good morning," Keller said in Veth Standard, which he spoke imperfectly but adequately, with the flat vowels of someone who learned it from recordings. "I was told you wanted to talk." She stared at him for 3 more seconds, an eternity in Veth interaction, where hesitation of that length was the equivalent of a flinch. And then she said, in the same language, "What are you?" "I'm the one they sent," Keller said. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a military unit when something has just happened that no one has a model for. It is not the silence of awe, which has a quality of uplift in it, a sense of ceilings being raised. It is not the silence of confusion, which is restless and uncomfortable. It is the silence of recalibration. The sound, if silence can have a sound, of people taking something they thought they understood and putting it back together differently. That silence fell over the Veth garrison on the ridge for almost a full minute after Keller put his mirror away and walked toward their delegation. Colonel Vane, watching from her position 300 meters back, had been in enough complicated situations to recognize the quality of it. She had been in rooms where the silence was hostile, and rooms where it was fearful, and rooms where it was the particular thick silence of a group that has just collectively realized they were wrong about something. This was the last kind. She had felt it before, but never this visibly, never across a distance she could watch with a scope, never in the shape of 7 alien figures going still on a ridge while a single human walked toward them. Pryor made a note on his data pad without saying anything. He had worked for Vane for 2 years and had learned that she thought better without the interruption of narration. What Vane was thinking, watching Keller cross the open ground, was something she would not put in the official record, but would think about for a long time afterward. She had sent him into that clearing because his face was a disruption to the Veth model. But what she had underestimated, what she had not fully calculated, was the specific way he moved. The walk, not a march. Keller was off the parade ground, had been off it for 8 months in a forward posting, and he walked the way people walk when they have been walking difficult ground for a long time and have made their peace with it. No performance, no presentation. Just a person going from here to there because there is where the work is. It was the walk of a man who had woken up 3 months ago with his face rebuilt wrong and had decided, apparently without significant drama, that walking was still something he did. It was the walk of the thing that the Veth, in their biological assessments, had not quite found a term for. The organism that had been damaged had observed its own damage, had incorporated that data into its self-assessment, and had continued. They did not have a good word for it. Humans had several. Stubbornness was one. Persistence was one. There was an older word, worn down by centuries of overuse, but still carrying something real at its core. Courage, not the courage of someone who doesn't know the odds. The courage of someone who has looked at the odds, acknowledged them, and decided to walk anyway. Lowered her scope. "Let him work," she said, to no one in particular. 3 months earlier, the 14th Expeditionaries had been something close to a functional unit, not thriving. Thriving is a word that required a certain minimum of supplies, rotations, and strategic coherence that the outer system postings had not received in 11 months, but functional. Mace Keller had been a staff sergeant in the mortar section, which meant he was responsible for a team of 6 and a piece of equipment that was increasingly difficult to keep operational given the calibration components it required, which had not been in any supply shipment since the spring. He had improvised. He was good at improvising. The mortar section, had stayed functional through a combination of Keller's mechanical intuition, his corporal's surprising gift for stripping salvageable parts from Veth equipment, and a maintenance philosophy that the official manuals would have described as irregular, but which produced results. The mine had been Veth manufacture, a proximity device small enough to miss in the dark, sensitive enough to respond to the weight of a boot at 30 centimeters. Keller had been checking the perimeter wire at 0400 when he found it by the wrong method. Not with the detector, which had been on the fritz for 2 days, but with the outside edge of his left boot, which was close enough to trigger the device without being directly over it. The blast wave had been mostly directional. His left boot was gone. 3 of the ribs on his left side had cracked. His left hand had burns to the wrist, and the left side of his face, from the hairline to the jaw, had encountered a fragment of casing, traveling at sufficient velocity to require, as the field medic put it with admirable economy, significant reconstruction. He had been conscious during the reconstruction, not because anyone wanted him to be. The base's anesthetic supply was at 20% of standard, earmarked for critical surgeries, but because the medic, a young man named Cortez who had done 4 years of pre-med before a different set of priorities intervened, had given Keller the choice between a smaller dose of sedative that would reduce his awareness without eliminating it, or no anesthetic at all and surgical speed instead of care. Keller had taken the sedative. He remembered the sounds more than the sensations. The specific, deeply strange sound of instruments working on tissue close to his ear. The sound of Cortez talking him through what he was doing, not because Keller asked for narration, but because Cortez, it turned out, talked when he was concentrating. Okay, the fragment is out. Okay, there's going to be a foam application. This is the reconstruction agent. It's going to feel warm, and then it's going to feel like pressure. You're doing fine. You're doing really well, Sergeant. Stay with me. The foam is setting. It's going to look rough for a while. The body does most of the work from here. You're going to be fine. Cortez had been right about the body doing most of the work. He had been slightly wrong about fine. Fine was a relative thing. Keller's face healed. The reconstructed tissue fused cleanly with the surviving architecture. The foam set correctly in some places and incorrectly in others, producing the topography that the Veth garrison would later find so alarming: the ridgeline of the cheekbone, the depression at the temple, the strangely highlighted jaw. When Keller's eye on that side opened again, it opened fully. He could see out of it without difficulty. The face that the small round mirror showed him in the mornings was different from the face he had owned before, but it was a face. It worked. It was his. He had looked at it for a long time, that first morning, with the mirror, in the tent that served as the unit's medical facility. He had expected something. He wasn't sure what. Horror, maybe, the body's own revision against its changed shape. Instead, he felt something more like recognition. The damage was there. It was visible. It was real. There was nothing useful in pretending otherwise, and pretending otherwise was not something Keller was constitutionally inclined to do. He put the mirror in his chest pocket and went back to the mortar section. "You look like hell," Corporal Diaz told him. "I look like a man who was 10 meters from a proximity mine," Keller said. "That's accurate. Are the calibration components in the last supply drop or not?" "No," Diaz said. "But I got something interesting from the Veth equipment we stripped last week. Come, look." That was how it went. That was how it had always gone. Keller put his hands on the problems in front of him and worked on them until they were smaller. The face was a problem he had already solved. He did not think about it more than that. Colonel Vane had come to him 6 weeks after the injury. She was a small, precise woman with gray at both temples, and the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent a long time making decisions with incomplete information and have learned to extract every possible signal from whatever is available. She had read his file. She knew his psych evaluations, his language aptitude scores, high particularly for the unfamiliar, and his record across 4 engagements with Veth forces. She had also spoken at length with Cortez, who had told her something about the man in the medical tent that had stayed with her. He looked at himself in the mirror for almost 10 minutes, Cortez had said. "I've had patients who wouldn't look at all. Most of them look for about 3 seconds and then put the mirror down. He looked for 10 minutes. And then he said, 'Thank you for the good work,' and went back to his unit. I've been thinking about that ever since." Vane had been thinking about it too. Specifically, she had been thinking about the Veth intelligence assessments, which described in painstaking detail the Veth psychological relationship with physical form. In Veth culture, the body was not merely a vehicle, it was a statement. A Veth who sustained significant physical damage and survived was a Veth who carried permanent evidence of failure. They did not display such evidence. They concealed it where possible. They found the concealment of damage to be not merely practical but morally appropriate. To display damage without shame was, in their cultural architecture, something close to an act of aggression. They won't be able to compute it, she had told Pryor. A human walking toward them with visible damage on his face, calm and direct. To them, that's either a being who doesn't understand what it is, or a being who knows exactly what it is and has decided something they can't interpret. She had paused. Either way, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is the first thing you need. Going into a negotiation, you should logically lose. She had gone to Keller and explained the situation with the directness she applied to everything. The Veth command is willing to talk. We think it's tactical. They want to consolidate before the next push, but talking is talking. We have approximately one strategic asset in this sector, and it's firepower, because they have more of it. It's not numbers, because they have more of those too. What we might have, if we play it correctly, is that they don't quite understand what they're dealing with. I want to use that. I want to send someone who will make them spend the first hour of negotiations trying to figure out what they're looking at instead of running their standard opening calculus. You want to send me because of my face, Keller said. I want to send you because of what you do with your face, Vane said. There's a difference. I've seen a lot of people carry injuries. Most of them carry them like a weight. You carry yours like it's not a surprise. That's unusual. That's specifically what I need. Keller had been quiet for a moment. What's the objective? Delay. Agreement to a temporary exclusion zone around the valley settlements. Give the civilians time to evacuate. If we're very lucky, a ceasefire long enough to get supply drops through. We are not trying to win the war in this meeting. We are trying to buy time. What's my authority to offer? None, Vane said. You're a sergeant. You're not authorized to offer anything. You're there to talk and to listen and to be something they don't have a model for. I'll be in your ear the whole time. Anything that sounds like an offer, I'll script it before you say it. And if they decide the correct response to a man with a scarred face walking toward them is to shoot him. Vane had looked at him steadily. That's the risk. I would not send you if I believed they would. But I want you to know I considered it and accepted it, and I'm asking you to accept it too. I accept it, Keller said, with the same uncomplicated directness he brought to everything. He had gone back to his tent and stood in front of the small mirror for a while, not with distress, with something more like assessment, the carpenter and the tool. What was this face capable of? What work could it do? Keth Solon's quarters in the Veth Field Command were a utilitarian study in Veth aesthetic principles. Surfaces of uniform gray-blue, illumination from sources that produced no shadows, equipment arranged in precise bilateral symmetry. The only exception was a collection of small objects on the surface adjacent to her resting platform. Items collected over 30 years of military service, arranged not by function, but by some private system of significance that her junior officers had learned not to ask about. A fragment of atmospheric crystal from a gas giant she had helped catalog early in her career. A communication token from a high commander, signifying exemplary tactical action. The shed carapace fragment of her youngest offspring, small and pale, the size of a human palm. She sat in the low resting posture that her people used when thinking, her four limbs folded in a configuration that would have looked, to a human observer, almost like what humans did when they curled around a problem. The physical expression of concentrated thought. Her second-in-command, Veth Nar, stood at the entrance to her quarters in the formal stance of waiting. Tell me what the biological assessments say about the human's condition, she said. Veth Nar had anticipated the question. He had pulled the relevant files the moment the human soldier had appeared in the clearing. Significant asymmetrical scarring on the left cranial face region, consistent with explosive force at close range. Secondary healed damage to the left upper limb. Primary mobility unaffected. Operational capacity assessed as high functional. A pause. The assessments categorize the individual as one who has sustained catastrophic damage to the face region and survived. I know that, Kethlin said. I can see that. I'm asking about his behavioral state. Veth Nar consulted his data. Biological observers logged his approach as, and I am reading directly here, atypical. Expected behavioral indicators of distress regarding the displayed damage were entirely absent. No avoidance behavior. No compensatory posturing. The individual appeared to make direct display of the damaged region on multiple occasions, including a sustained period of apparent self-examination using a reflective instrument. He looked at himself in the mirror, Keth Solon said. Yes, for how long? Approximately 4 minutes from the observation footage. And his affect during that time? Veth Nar hesitated. He was a competent officer and an adequate biologist, but human affect was notoriously difficult to read without specialization. Neutral, he said finally. Observers described it as neutral, no distress indicators, no shame-adjacent behaviors. The closest analog in our catalog would be. He paused again, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. The closest analog would be the post-combat assessment behavior our own warriors exhibit after surviving engagement, the self-examination of a survivor. Keth Solan was quiet for a long time. He looked at his own damage, she said, the way our warriors look at theirs in private, without shame, without performance, as a simple accounting of what is. Yes, Vethnar said. That is the closest analog available. Then he put the mirror away and walked toward us. Yes, she unfolded from her resting posture. The movement was fluid and economical, the motion of something that had been still long enough and had now finished thinking. Schedule the formal negotiation for midday. I want the translation teams available. She moved toward her equipment station, and I want a full biological review of human trauma response patterns. Specifically, I want to understand how a species that experiences asymmetrical damage as visible, permanent, and irrecoverable has nonetheless produced individuals who display it without concealment. She picked up a piece of equipment from the station and began the calibration process that preceded every meeting. I want to understand what that means. Vethnar noted the order and did not quite successfully conceal his discomfort. Commander, do you believe the negotiation will be productive? Keth Solan made the sound that her species produced in place of the human laugh. Not contemptuous, something more complicated than that. I believe, she said, that I am going to be spending the next several hours in conversation with something I do not yet understand. That is not my preferred position. She looked at the shed fragment of her youngest offspring's carapace, small and pale on the symmetrical shelf. But it is honest, she said. The formal negotiation took place under the protocol that had been established for first contact adjacent engagements, a structure of human manufacture, neutral ground by consensus, a translation team on each side operating in parallel. The structure was a prefabricated shelter of the kind that expeditionary logistics dropped in advance of operations, a flat-roofed module that smelled of pressurized air and human sweat and was, by Veth standards, aggressively asymmetrical in almost every dimension. Keth Solan entered it with the studied composure of someone who had prepared specifically for this. Keller was already there. He was sitting on the human side of the table with a cup of something that produced steam, and he was reading. An actual physical document. Papers. Folded and annotated in handwriting. When Keth Solan entered, he looked up, set the document down on the table with a kind of finality that suggested he was done with it, and picked up his cup. The cup. She had been briefed on human social rituals around warm liquid consumption. It was a significant social signal, the assessment said. The offering of a warm beverage indicated a desire for non-hostile engagement. The retaining of one's own warm beverage while not offering indicated. The assessments had several theories. None of them matched what she was seeing. He was not performing warmth for her benefit. He was not marking territory with the cup. He was simply drinking something warm because he liked it. It's the same way that she arranged her personal objects by private significance rather than operational function, because some things you do just because they are yours. Commander Keth Solan, Keller said in Veth Standard, with the flat vowels of the recordings. Thank you for agreeing to this. Sergeant Keller, she said. She arranged herself in the accommodation they had prepared for Veth-seated posture, a low platform, properly symmetrical, and oriented her optical clusters toward him with the full attention that in Veth culture was simultaneously respectful and slightly threatening. I would like to ask you something before we begin. He waited. Your damage, she said. The assessments indicate it is recent, months only. 3 months, he said. In our culture, damage of that kind, visible damage to the central face region, carries significant weight. The individual would typically seek concealment, would cover it, would consider its display a matter of. She paused, looking for the right word in a language that was not hers and had been built for other purposes. Shame, she said finally. That is the closest word your language offers. Keller considered this. He lifted his cup, took a small drink, set it down. No, he said. No, it doesn't work that way. Not for me. Not for most of us. He tilted his head slightly, which was another gesture the translation teams had not fully resolved, something between inquiry and emphasis. This face is the face I have. It works. My eyes see, my mouth speaks, my brain functions. The shape of it changed. The shape of it changed because something happened that I survived. He looked at her steadily across the table, with the same quality he had brought to the mirror and to the clearing. The simple, flat, accounting of what is. If I hid it, I'd be hiding the evidence that I survived. Why would I do that? Keth Solon was still. In 30 years of military service, she had negotiated with 9 species. 7 of them had been, in the relevant sense, comprehensible. Their logic followed the structures that Veth strategic culture had cataloged and classified. Their openings and their positions and their concessions followed patterns that could be anticipated and worked with. One of them had been incomprehensible in ways that were clearly tactical, a species using performance to disrupt her ability to read them, a deliberate deployment of confusion as a weapon. This was different. This was not tactical incomprehensibility. This was a man who genuinely simply did not understand what she expected him to be ashamed of, who was sitting from her with 3 months of healed damage on his face and talking about survival the way she talked about outcomes, as a fact, as a reference point, as the thing from which you begin. She realized she had been sitting in silence for too long. She recalibrated. I see, she said, which was what you said in Veth Standard when you were still processing. We should talk about the valley, Keller said, with the same unceremonious directness he brought to everything. There are approximately 11,000 civilians there. Farmers, mostly, and their families. They have no military relevance. The tactical value of the valley itself is. He picked up the folded papers and opened one. Negligible by any assessment we've run. Your garrison can hold the ridge without the valley. Holding the valley costs you materiel and personnel that you'd be better positioned using 40 kilometers east, where the terrain actually matters. It was the most direct opening she had encountered in 9 years of formal negotiation. No preamble, no formula. Just, here is the situation. Here is the logic. Here is what I want. She found herself, against all expectation, almost amused. You presume to know our tactical priorities, she said. I presume to know your terrain assessment because we have the same terrain, Keller said. And I know your logistics because we've been watching your supply lines for 4 months. The valley is a liability for you right now. Moving your garrison clear of it costs you nothing you wouldn't want to spend elsewhere. He looked at her. The civilians need 6 weeks to evacuate. We need a supply corridor for humanitarian materiel. After that, the valley is neutral. Neither of our forces maintains position there. It becomes a buffer. The translation team on his side was working hard. Kether Solon's own team was confirming the sense of it. She listened to both, filtering, and came away with the same core. He was not asking her for something that he needed desperately. He was offering her something that made sense. That was also unusual. She looked at his papers. Those are your assessments? Yes. You did them yourself? My unit did. We've been in this sector for 8 months. He folded the papers and slid them across the table toward her. You can keep those. I have copies. She did not touch them immediately. She was thinking about a species that handed its own intelligence assessments to the opposing command across a negotiating table, without apparent anxiety about what the opposing command would do with them, because the logic was sound enough that whether she agreed with the analysis was less important than whether she trusted the person giving it to her. She was thinking about a man with a ruined face who looked at himself in mirrors without flinching and talked about survival as a starting point rather than an end. She was thinking about the shed fragment of her youngest offspring's carapace on the shelf in her quarters and how she had carried it for 11 years, not because it was aesthetically significant, but because it was real, because it was evidence of something she had been part of, because some things you carry because they are yours. She picked up the papers. The negotiation took 4 hours. Colonel Vane, 300 meters up and behind on the ridge, listened to every word through the relay in Keller's ear. She spoke to him 4 times. Twice to confirm that he had authority to agree to specific provisions she had pre-approved, once to warn him that a phrasing he had used could be misread in the translation as a commitment he wasn't authorized to make, and once near the end, to say, the Eastern Corridor. Push on the Eastern Corridor. She's going to give it to you. She gave it to them. The agreement was not a ceasefire. It was not a peace. It was a temporary exclusion zone in the valley, with a humanitarian corridor for supply movement, lasting 60 days, renewable by mutual consent. It was the document equivalent of 2 people in a burning building deciding to set down the fight and deal with the fire first. It was, Vane thought, watching the signatures being transmitted up to her datapad, more than she had expected from this day. Keller signed for the expeditionary forces. His handwriting was clear and unadorned, no flourishes, no compression, just letters in a plain hand, the way you'd write something you intended to be read. Keth Salon signed for her garrison with the Veth marking system, a pattern etched rapidly into a receptor pad, precise as everything else she did. When it was done, She looked at Keller across the table with the flat, total attention she had brought into the room. Why did they send you? She asked. Because I was the one who asked to come, Keller said. She was quiet for a moment. You asked. The colonel was going to send someone from the diplomatic team. I told her I wanted to go. Why? He looked at her. He looked at the space between them, the width of a table in a prefabricated shelter on a planet that neither of their species had been born on, across which they had spent 4 hours taking apart a problem and putting it back together in a shape that was better than the one it had arrived in. Because I was curious, he said, about you, about whether it was possible to do this. He tilted his head slightly in the gesture the translation teams had not resolved. Wasn't it? Keth Solon made the sound again, the one that was not quite laughing. It appears it was, she said. In the weeks that followed the agreement, the valley became a strange kind of border zone, not peaceful exactly, but actively not hostile, which was a different and more fragile thing. Veth garrison patrols moved through the western hills on their schedule. Expeditionary scouts moved through the eastern terrain on theirs. In the valley itself, the slow machinery of civilian evacuation operated under the buffer of the 60-day window, and neither military force interfered with it. It was, Vane noted in her command log, the most complex non-engagement she had managed in 8 years of Veth theater operations. Keller went back to the mortar section. Diaz had the calibration problem partially solved using the salvaged Veth component, but there were tolerances that needed work. Keller spent 3 days on it, alone mostly, in the habit of focused attention he brought to all mechanical problems, and on the 4th day the component seated correctly and the calibration held. You were in the meeting for 4 hours, Diaz said, watching him test the newly calibrated piece. What did you talk about for 4 hours? Everything, Keller said, and mostly nothing. You talk around the problem for a while. You look at it from different angles. And then there's a moment where both sides can see the same thing, and you just have to not be stupid about it. And what did you see the same thing about? Keller set the calibrated component down and looked at it for a moment before answering that the valley doesn't matter to either of us as much as what happens after the valley, and that 11,000 people who have nothing to do with any of this would have a bad 60 days if we couldn't figure that out. Diaz was quiet for a moment. Are you going back? For more talks? Maybe, Keller said. Colonel Vane thinks the Veth command is going to want renewal discussions at day 45. If they do, she'll decide who goes. You'll ask to go again, Diaz said. It was not a question. Keller almost smiled. The scarred side of his face didn't move the way it used to, but the expression was recognizable. A small private thing. The expression of someone who knows what they're going to do and is comfortable with knowing it. Probably, he said. Keth Solon filed a full report on the negotiation with the Veth Strategic Command. She had been meticulous, as she always was, detailed accounting of each position and concession, analysis of the human tactical logic, her assessment of the agreement's strategic implications. She had appended a section she titled, in the formal Veth classification system, as Anomalous Behavioral Data Human Personnel. She described the scarred face, she described the mirror. She described the opening approach in the clearing. She described the moment in the negotiation when she had asked about his damage and received an answer she did not have a category for. Why would I hide evidence that I survived? She had been turning this over for weeks. It was not a rhetorical question. She had come to understand, with the specific clarity that follows sustained thought, that he had not been asking rhetorically. He was genuinely curious about the Veth assumption. He could not locate the logic of hiding survival. In Veth culture, damage was concealed because its display indicated that the individual had encountered a force greater than themselves and had, in some fundamental sense, been diminished by the encounter. The damaged Veth carried evidence of their own inadequacy. The concealment was not vanity. It was the recognition that to display damage was to tell everyone who looked at you, there is something out there that did this to me, and I did not prevent it. And this is what remaining looks like. But the human sergeant had sat across from her with precisely that evidence on his face, visible, unmitigated, and said, I survived, as if the survival were the point, as if the damage were not the story but the context. Not what defined him, but what he had come through. His face, she had realized slowly, was not an exhibition of inadequacy. It was a record of persistence. The distinction seemed small from outside. From inside, she was beginning to understand it was the size of everything. She added to her report a final line. Recommend expanded study of human trauma response, specifically regarding the relationship between displayed physical damage and individual self. Assessment. Current Veth strategic models assume human behavioral patterns analogous to our own in this domain. They are not. This has significant implications for all future engagement modeling. Her commanding general read the report in full. He was a methodical intelligence of considerable experience and not easily surprised. He read the section on anomalous behavioral data 3 times. Then he flagged the report for the highest level strategic review and made a notation in his own files. These are not what we thought they were. The 60 days were not clean. Nothing in a contested zone ever is. On day 19, a Veth patrol and an expeditionary reconnaissance unit came within visual range of each other in the buffer zone's northern edge, a navigation error. On the Veth side, a patrol extension on the human side, the product of 2 separate failures of communication that came within about 400 meters of becoming something that would have ended the agreement. The human patrol leader, a corporal named Chen, put her unit on hold and got Vane on the line. The Veth patrol leader, a junior officer whose name the translation teams rendered as something approximating Veth Marin, did the same. For 11 minutes, 2 groups of armed soldiers sat still at 400 meters while their respective commands worked out what had happened and what would happen next. The agreement survived. On day 31, a Veth resupply convoy took a route that brought it through the northern edge of the corridor, which was not a violation of the agreement's letter, but was, as Keller noted when reviewing the movement data, a fairly aggressive reading of what the agreed boundaries permitted. He wrote a 3-paragraph analysis and gave it to Vane. Vane sent a formal inquiry to the Veth command under the agreement's communication protocol. The convoy rerouted. No response was offered regarding why the original route had been chosen. Vane made a note in her log, testing, standard practice, keep watching. On day 40, with the evacuation at 63% complete and the supply corridor having pushed through 3 shipments of humanitarian materiel that included medical equipment and food stores, Keth Solan requested direct communication with the Expeditionary Command. Not negotiation, communication. She wanted, as the formal request put it, a status assessment with the prior human representative. Vane came to Keller's workspace in the mortar section. He was doing something with a component spread on a work cloth, and he looked up at her with the mild attention of someone accustomed to being interrupted with important things. She's asking for you specifically, Vane said. I know, Keller said. He had been expecting it. Not with certainty. You never had certainty in these spaces, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has been paying attention to something and has begun to understand it. I want to know what you think she wants, Vane said. He was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the work cloth. I think she's running a different calculation than when we first started. I think the first meeting was about trying to understand what I was. I think now she's decided she understands it well enough to work with, and she wants to know if the agreement can be extended. He paused. I also think she's under pressure from her command to get more from the renewal, terms than the original deal gave her. She's going to come in with a revised position, the Eastern Corridor boundaries, and I think we give a little on the Eastern Corridor in exchange for an extended window. 90 days instead of 60. The evacuation is at 63%, and the rate is slowing down. Some of the remaining civilians are harder to move, elderly, medical cases. We need more time. He picked up the component, looked at it, set it down again. She'll take that trade. The Eastern Corridor boundary adjustment costs us surveillance coverage in terrain we weren't using effectively anyway. Vane looked at him for a long moment. You've been doing my job, she said. You're busy, he said, and I've been thinking about it. She sat down on the edge of the work surface across from him. Tell me what you think is actually happening here. Not tactically. The bigger picture. He was quiet for longer this time. It was the kind of quiet that was working, not empty. I think she's curious, he said finally. The same way I was curious. I think she went into that first meeting with a model of what we were, and I disrupted the model, and now she's building a new one, and she keeps wanting to check it against the actual thing. He picked up the component again, turned it in his hands. That's not nothing. That's actually a lot. Most of the species interactions that go wrong because one side decides they understand the other side completely and stops checking. She's still checking. And you think that's enough to work with? I think that's more than enough to work with, Keller said. I think curiosity might be the only thing that's ever enough to work with. The meeting at day 43 happened in the same prefabricated shelter, same table, same translation teams. Keller arrived first again. He had the same cup of the same warm liquid. He had not brought papers this time. The analysis he had prepared was in his memory, where he could access it without the physical tell of consulting materials. Keth Solan arrived with her composure fully assembled, her carapace flawless, her optical clusters moving with a total attention that was simultaneously respectful and threatening. She took her place on the low platform and looked at him. Sergeant Keller, she said. Commander Keth Salan, he said. You look well. In Veth culture, this was a statement that required care. Commenting on physical appearance in an opening was a loaded gesture tied to the whole complex of shame and display and biological status that had been part of their first meeting. Keth Solan had prepared for several opening gambits from him. She had not prepared for this one. As do you, she said carefully after a moment. It was the only time she had used the phrase. In Veth social culture, as do you, directed at someone with visible damage on their face, was a complex statement. It could be read as sarcasm. It could be read as formulaic deflection. Keth Solan meant it as neither. She meant it as, I see you clearly. I see what you are. You look like yourself. She believed, from the slight change in the quality of his stillness, that he understood. I'd like to talk about the extension, he said. Yes, she said. I'd like that too. The second negotiation took 3 hours. They settled on 93 days, the Eastern Corridor adjustment, and a provision they had not discussed in the first meeting, a shared communication channel for patrol commanders, direct line, no translation required, a practical concession to the near incident on day 19, an acknowledgement that the spaces between commands were where agreements went to die. When the terms were finalized, there was a pause, the same settling quality that a room gets when work is finished, and the next thing hasn't started yet. Keller looked at the terms on his datapad. Keth Salan looked at the terms on hers. The channel will be useful, she said. I think so, he said. Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, she said, your medic. The one who did the reconstruction. He looked up. The reports indicated a medic operating under significant resource constraints, limited materials, limited preparation time. He performed reconstruction work that was, by our biological assessment standards, technically sophisticated. She paused, in the way she paused when she was working out how to say something precisely. In Veth practice, a medic who produced that result under those conditions would be considered highly capable. The work is visible, as you said, as evidence of what occurred, but the survival it produced is evident as well. Keller was quiet for a moment. He had not expected this. Somehow, in all his preparation, he had not prepared for this. His Miss Cortez, he said. Specialist Cortez. He did good work, Keth Salan said. You should tell him that. I did, Keller said, 3 months ago. A pause of his own, but I'll tell him again. She made the sound, the one that was not quite laughing. It had a different quality this time. Less complicated and more simple. Good, she said. On day 61, the evacuation completed. The last convoy of civilians, 43 people, 8 of them on medical stretchers, the remainder the particular stubborn remainder of any displacement, people who had waited until there was no more waiting to be done, moved through the corridor in a line of vehicles that the expeditionary had secured and the Veth garrison had by agreement made no movement to intercept. Keller watched the last vehicle from the ridge. He was not alone, Diaz was there, and Chen from the Northern Patrol. And Cortez, who had walked up from the medical section because someone had told him there was something worth seeing. They watched the convoy move through the valley in the gray morning light, watched it cross the far perimeter, watched the dust settle. That's everyone, Chen asked. That's everyone, Vane said from behind them. She had her scope and her datapad, and the particular expression she got when a thing she had been working toward for a long time had arrived and she was taking a moment to acknowledge it before moving to the next problem. 11,214 people. All out. All out? Keller repeated. Cortez was looking at him, not the valley. Keller was aware of it. The same way you're aware of something in your peripheral vision that you're not ready to fully turn toward. He let it sit for a while. I'm going to tell you something, Cortez said finally. Okay, Keller said. When I was working on you in the tent, I was scared is probably not quite the right word. Scared I was doing it wrong. The foam wasn't setting the way it was supposed to, and I had to work around the calibration, and I kept thinking, the calibration is wrong, the reconstruction is going to be wrong, and this person is trusting me, and I'm going to. He stopped, started again. When you came back, 3 months later with your face, and you said thank you for the good work, I didn't know whether to tell you it wasn't as good as it should have been. I know it wasn't as good as it should have been, Keller said. The foam set wrong. I could seize it. He looked at the valley. You did what you could with what you had, and I survived. That's the good work. He paused. The rest is just what my face looks like. Cortez didn't say anything for a moment. You should have been a medic. Keller almost laughed. The scarred side of his face still didn't move the same way as the right side, and probably never would, but the expression was there in the rest of him. in the angle of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness, the particular way he was looking at the valley. I was already something, he said. That's the thing about what you already are. You don't have to be something else to be worth keeping. On the ridge above the opposite side of the valley, visible at the limit of what the naked eye could resolve, there was movement. The Veth garrison's patrol route, regular as it had been for 93 days now, but pausing, a single figure, standing at the edge of the ridge, elevated and still. Keller looked across the valley at the single still figure. He didn't reach for his scope. He nodded. The renewal discussions happened at day 89. Not in the prefabricated shelter this time. Both sides had agreed that the shelter had served its purpose, and that the ongoing nature of the arrangement required something with less of the quality of an emergency measure. The Veth had proposed a permanent structure. The expeditionary had proposed the same. They had agreed on a jointly constructed facility at the valley's center, a neutral point, the kind of place that announces by its existence that two parties intend to keep talking. Keller walked to it on the morning of day 89 through autumn air that was turning cold, the light, thin, and horizontal the way it gets when a season is changing, casting long shadows from the trees at the valley's edge. His breath was visible. He had his hands in his pockets. He was not thinking about anything dramatic. He was thinking about the calibration problem with the mortar section's secondary unit, which Diaz had identified, and which was going to require either the right component or a solution Keller hadn't thought of yet. He would think of something. He had been thinking of things for a long time. That was what he did. That was what they did. All of them. All the humans in all the forward positions on all the contested worlds. The thing that the Veth strategic models had not quite accounted for in their initial assessments and were slowly, painstakingly revising. Humans did not stop. Not because they were unaware of the odds against them. Not because they were incapable of calculating how badly they were outgunned. But because the arithmetic of what was possible and the arithmetic of what was worth trying were, for humans, two separate calculations that didn't automatically match. You could know you were losing and still find something to try. You could know the foam was setting wrong and still work around the calibration. You could know that the valley was eventually going to be contested again, that the 93 days were not a peace but a pause, that the next push was coming somewhere, and still spend the pause building a permanent structure in the valley's center, because permanent structures were for people who intend to be present for what comes next. He arrived at the facility and went inside. It smelled of new construction and the specific air treatment that the Veth environmental systems produced. Not unpleasant, a hint of something oceanic. The table was here, and the chairs and platforms and the translation equipment, and the second thing he had not expected, a tray on the human side of the table, and on it a container producing steam. He stood looking at it for a moment. He didn't know if Keth Salan had ordered it, or if someone on her staff had learned the ritual by observation and made an independent decision. He didn't know if the liquid in the container was anything like what he usually drank. It didn't matter. He went to the tray and checked the container. The liquid was something Veth produced, amber and herbal, nothing he recognized. He poured a small amount into the provided cup and held it with both hands and waited. Kethsalon arrived 6 minutes later, which was exactly on schedule. She saw him with the cup. She made the sound, the one that had started as contemptuous amusement and had become, over 3 negotiations and 93 days, something that did not have a clean translation in any language available to either of them. Not quite laughter, not quite warmth, something between them, without a name yet. "You're drinking it," she said. "I'm holding it," Keller said honestly. "I haven't decided about drinking it yet. It tastes terrible to human palates," she said. "The molecular composition is—" "I knows," he said. "Probably." He took a drink. It tasted like salt and copper and something green and distant. It tasted like a thing he had not tasted before. He held it for a moment, aware of all of it. The strange liquid, the cold outside, the long morning shadows, the valley that had been full and was now empty and would be full again someday, the permanent structure around him, the figure across from him who had spent 93 days revising her model of what he was. "Well?" she said. "It's different," he said. "That is not a useful evaluation. I know." He set the cup down. "I'll tell you more when I've had more time with it." She settled into her platform with the precision she brought to all physical actions and oriented her full attention toward him. "The extension terms," she said. "The extension terms," he agreed. They worked. It was what they did. On either side of an equation that neither of them had chosen, and both of them were trying to make less catastrophic, they worked, with what they had, around the calibration that was wrong, toward the reconstruction that was imperfect and real and evidence of something, toward the next thing and the thing after that, because some work you do, because it is yours, because it is the work that is in front of you, because you have a face and it works, and your eyes see and your mouth speaks, and you are still here, and here is where the work is. Mace Keller put his hands on the table. The negotiation began. By the end of that day, they had a new agreement, not just an extension, an expansion. The valley as a permanent buffer zone, jointly administered, a framework for communication that did not require the emergency protocols of the original arrangement, a provision for civilian reoccupation under monitored conditions. The farmers could return, the families could return, the valley could be a valley again instead of a tactical assessment. It was more than Vane had sent him to get. It was more than Keth Salon had been authorized to offer when she had walked into the facility that morning. They had both exceeded their briefs. That was the kind of thing that happened when two people spent enough time in a room working at the same problem from both sides, and one of them had a face that had been rebuilt wrong, and a mirror he looked into every morning, and the other had a collection of private objects arranged not by function but by significance, and both of them had decided, separately, in different ways, from entirely different architectures of thought, that survival was a starting point rather than an endpoint. Vane, when Keller walked out of the facility and called in the terms, was quiet for almost 30 seconds. She started. Stopped. That took you all day. Yes, he said. It's more than I authorized. Yes, he said. I'm going to have to take this up the chain. I know, he said. They're going to want to know how you got here from where we started. He was standing outside the facility in the evening air. The valley was dark now, the autumn sunset already gone, and the stars were coming out over the ridge in the way they did out here, without the interference of city light, hard and clear and very many. He looked at them for a moment. The ridge across the valley was dark. The patrol light of the Veth garrison moved steadily along its route. Tell them we talked, he said. Later, months later, in a different place, in a briefing room far from the valley, Colonel Vane stood in front of a strategic command review and attempted to explain what had happened in the valley and why it mattered. She had the documents, the terms, the data, the surveillance footage, the translated reports from the Veth side that their intelligence teams had eventually acquired. She had all the hard materials of the thing, the measurable evidence of what a 60-day agreement had become and what it had opened into. She presented all of it with her characteristic precision, taking nothing for granted, accounting for every variable. At the end, the senior officer in the room, a general named Voss, who had spent 30 years trying to understand what made certain engagements survivable, asked her a question she had not been asked before. What made the difference? In the first meeting, when Keller walked into the clearing, what actually happened there? Vane thought about it. She had thought about it many times, not always productively, because it was the kind of thing that resisted the categories she usually worked in. He looked different to them, she said finally. Not threatening different, just other. Something outside their model. And he knew it. And he used it? He used it by doing nothing with it, she said. He walked in, he stood there, he was what he was. He looked at himself in a mirror for 4 minutes, and then he put the mirror away and said good morning. She paused. The Veth commander didn't know what she was dealing with, and that uncertainty, not fear, not confusion, just genuine uncertainty about the nature of the thing she was looking at, was the first breath of room we'd had in that sector in 8 months. Voss was quiet for a moment. Because of a scar. Because of what he did with it, Vane said. The scar was just the scar. What mattered was, he was not ashamed. And that was a thing they had no model for. A warrior who had been damaged and was not concealing the damage and was not performing bravado about it either. Just walking, being present, starting from the truth of what had happened to him and working forward from there. She looked at the table for a moment. That's the thing you can't replicate in a negotiation framework. You can't train for it. It either comes from a person who actually is that way, or it doesn't come. She looked at Voss. He asked for the briefing on Veth biology twice. He wanted to understand what his face would mean to them. And then he thought about it for a while, and he came to me and asked to go, not because it was a dramatic gesture, because he genuinely believed it was the best chance we had. Voss made a note. And was it? We have 11,000 people who went home, Vane said. We have a valley that farmers are planting in right now. We have a framework that the Veth Command has used as the basis for 3 other regional de-escalation agreements in the past 7 months. She picked up her data pad. Whatever it was the best chance we had. And it worked. In the valley, the farmers returned in spring. The land had been untended for the better part of a year, And it showed the fields overgrown, the irrigation channels silted, the equipment left behind dusty and in need of attention. It was the kind of damage that looks worse than it is, the kind that responds to work. The farmers were familiar with that kind of damage. They had been farming this land for generations. Through things harder than a year of neglect, through drought and flood and the casual indifference of weather, through all the ordinary catastrophes that the land periodically offered and that the farmers responded to in the manner of people who have decided that the land is worth the labor, that tomorrow is worth the trouble, that the work in front of you is the work worth doing. They fixed the irrigation channels, they cleared the overgrowth, they checked the equipment and repaired what needed repairing, and replaced what was beyond repair with something improvised and functional. By midsummer, the fields were planted. By late summer, the first harvest came in. It was not the best harvest anyone could remember. It was not the worst. It was the harvest of a year that had been difficult, and was now, without fanfare, productive. The farmers took it in and put it up and did not make speeches about it. It was what it was. It was real. In the facility at the valley's center, Mace Keller and Keth Solon were having what had become their regular monthly meeting. Not a formal negotiation any longer, but a working session, a maintenance of the framework, the ongoing labor of a thing they had built together that needed tending. They did not always agree. The Eastern Corridor remained a point of recurring discussion. There were provisions that each of them believed their command had interpreted too loosely, and provisions they believed the other command had interpreted too loosely. And these overlapped in ways that required regular, careful attention. It was not simple, it was not comfortable, it was the kind of relationship that a diplomat would have recognized immediately as functional, and which, being functional, required constant maintenance, because functional things break when you stop paying attention to them. Keller had gotten used to the Veth herbal liquid. It still tasted like salt and copper and something green and distant, but he had stopped cataloging the taste as strange and started cataloging it as itself. He poured it the same way he'd pour anything, without a fuss, because it was what there was. Keth Solon watched him do this across the table. She had been watching him do it for 6 months. She had been trying for 6 months to articulate in formal terms what it represented. The human behavior of accommodating foreign material, of incorporating the unfamiliar into routine until it becomes ordinary. She had written 3 drafts of a formal analysis of it and discarded all 3 as insufficient. The thing kept escaping the framework. "You've decided about the liquid," she said. He looked at his cup. "A long time ago," he said. "I just didn't say. What did you decide?" He held the cup with both hands, looked at it for a moment. The room around them was the permanent structure they had built, the facility in the center of the valley that had started as an emergency measure and become something else, the kind of thing you build when you intend to be present for what comes next. "That it's ours," he said. "Not mine, not yours. This," he gestured, a small economical gesture at the room, at the table, at the work between them. "Whatever this is, it's ours." Keth Solon was still. Outside, the farmers were bringing in the harvest. The light was golden and late and falling at the angle it falls when a season is almost done and the next one has not yet started. The Veth Garrison Patrol moved along the ridge on its schedule. The expeditionary scouts moved on theirs. In the buffer between them, a valley that had been empty was full again, and the fields were heavy, and the work was going forward. Keth Solon reached across the table and picked up the document they had been working on. She made a small addition to one provision in the precise Veth marking system and slid it back. Keller read the addition. He made a small adjustment on the human side, slid it back. She read it, made the sound. Keller picked up his cup. The work continued. There were things that did not make it into any official report. On day 26 of the buffer period, a young woman named Sarah, not Sarah Veth, not a Veth soldier, just a farmer's daughter with that name, 17 years old, and already doing the work of an adult because the adults around her were stretched too thin, brought a covered pot to the perimeter of the expeditionary base. She had walked 4 hours from the village that was in the process of being evacuated. She had cooked the pot's contents that morning, before dawn, and carried it wrapped in cloth against the cold, and she set it down at the checkpoint and told the sentry, in the regional dialect that the translator had to work at, that she wanted to give it to the soldier with the face. The sentry had brought it to Vane, who had brought it to Keller. It was a stew. Dense, heavily spiced, the kind of food that a community makes when it has more of some things than others and has learned, over generations, to work with what it has. Keller stood in the command section and looked at the pot for a long moment. "The girl says she heard what happened." Vane said, "She knows about the agreement. She knows her family has time to get out because of the meeting. She paused. She asked one of the medics about you. She was told you were the soldier who negotiated with the alien commander. She asked what you looked like. And she sent the stew. Keller carried the pot back to the mortar section and shared it with the unit. It was rich and unfamiliar and very good. The spices were local, something they hadn't had access to in the 8 months of the posting. And the vegetables were from the valley's agricultural stores, the food of the place they had been trying to protect. Diaz had 2 bowls. Chen, passing through from the patrol section, had one. Cortez came by later and ate standing up, with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned that medical section meals happen in whatever window presents itself. Good? Keller asked him. Very good, Cortez said. He looked at the pot. Where did this come from? Keller told him. Cortez was quiet for a moment. He set down his bowl and picked it up again. She sent food, he said. She walked 4 hours and she sent food. Yes, Keller said. Cortez was 23 years old and had been in forward postings for 2 years, and had done things he found it difficult to think about, and things he was proud of, and more things he was still categorizing. He had the expression of someone placing something in the right category. Okay, he said, after a moment. Okay. That night, Keller wrote the detail about the stew in his personal log, not the operational log, not the mission record, but the separate document he had been keeping since the start of the posting, in the habit of someone who intends to remember what happened accurately and knows that official records are not the same as true ones. He wrote, a girl named Sarah carried a pot of stew 4 hours on a cold morning to give to a soldier she had never met because she knew her family had time to leave. Then he wrote, that is why the work is worth doing. On day 37, the Veth general commanding the regional theater sent a formal communication to Colonel Vane. It was transmitted through the established protocol, translated by both teams, and its sense was clear enough. The Veth command had reviewed the agreement, reviewed Keth Solan's report, and had concluded that the arrangement was satisfactory. Keth Solan would remain in command of the garrison. The 60-day window would proceed as agreed. There was an additional line at the end of the communication. It was flagged by both translation teams as requiring interpretation, because the Veth phrase used was one that did not have a direct human equivalent. The teams rendered it 3 different ways, and Vane brought all 3 to Keller. The first rendering, we acknowledge the existence of a variable not currently in our models. The second rendering, we note a quality in the human personnel requiring further study. The third rendering, which was the translation team lead's preferred interpretation, was the most direct. We have not yet understood what we are dealing with. Keller read all 3. He set the datapad down. He picked it up again and read the third one a second time. That's accurate, he said. You don't find it threatening? Vane asked. No, he said. I find it honest. He set the pad down. When I walked into that clearing, I didn't know what I was dealing with either. I still don't, not fully. Neither does Keth Solan. That's not a failure, that's the situation. 2 species that don't fully understand each other, trying to do something specific and survivable. He looked at the datapad. The Veth general is saying, we know we don't know. That's more than half the war right there. Vane looked at him. You have a very particular way of looking at things, she said. Is that a problem? No, she said. It's the opposite of a problem. She picked up the datapad and closed the communication. Renewal discussions. Day 45, you're leading. The day before the day 43 meeting, Keller spent an hour at the perimeter in the evening and did something he had not done since the morning in the medical tent. He took out the mirror and looked at his face. Not out of vanity, not out of sentiment. With the same quality of assessment he brought to mechanical problems. Not the carpenter now, or not only the carpenter, but the navigator. Taking a bearing, here is where I am, here is what is true. The face had continued to change as Cortez had said it would, the body doing most of the work. The most severe of the ridges had softened slightly as the underlying tissue had settled into its final configuration. The depression at the temple was smaller than it had been. The jawline was less irregular. It was still asymmetrical, would always be asymmetrical, was his permanently now, the shape his survival had taken, but it was less raw. It had completed itself. He looked at it for a while in the evening light, the way he had looked at it in the medical tent, without specific emotion in either direction, without pride and without regret, without the performance of acceptance, and without the performance of anything else. It was just his face. He had built a 60-day agreement with it and bought time for 11,000 people. Tomorrow he was going to use it again, or rather, he was going to use whatever it was about him that the face had helped make visible, the quality of someone who knows what they are and where they've been and does not pretend otherwise. He put the mirror back in his pocket. He went inside and reviewed the analysis one more time, not because he needed to, he knew it, but because preparation was how you showed respect to the work, and the work deserved respect. In the morning, he ate breakfast with Diaz and Chen and one of the newer members of the unit, a private named Osi, who had arrived with the last supply rotation and was still calibrating himself to the specific atmosphere of a forward posting. Osi was quiet, still carrying the tightness of someone who hasn't yet worked out the rhythm of things. How long before it stops feeling like this? Osi asked at some point in the meal. He gestured, a small gesture that encompassed everything. The base, the sky, the distant ridge, the particular quality of morning air in a place where all mornings might not be ordinary. 6 weeks, Diaz said immediately, with the authority of someone who had made the transition and remembered where it was. 3, Chen said, for some people. Keller looked at Osai. The private had the face of someone who was hoping for a different answer but would take an honest one. It changes, Keller said. Not the same for everyone, and not on a schedule. But it changes. He drank his coffee. You learn what you can do. You learn what you can't. You learn the difference between the two, and you stop spending energy trying to turn the second kind into the first kind. He set the cup down. After that, it's work, and work you know how to do. Osi was quiet for a moment. He looked at Keller's face with the directness of someone who has been wanting to ask something and has decided to stop waiting. Did the mine? He stopped. Yes, Keller says, before he could reassemble the question. Yes, it did, and I'm fine. The face is different, and it works, and I'm fine. He looked at Osai without emphasis, just directly, without performance. You can look at it. It's okay. Osi looked at it. He was obviously trying not to be obvious about looking at it, which resulted in the sort of elaborate visual casualness that is more conspicuous than just looking. Keller waited it out. It doesn't, Osi started, stopped again. You don't seem bothered, Keller said. Yeah, Keller said. This is what I look like. I've got things to do today. He stood up, picked up his cup. You'll figure out what that sentence means for you. It's different for everyone, but it's the same sentence. He went to the negotiating shelter. He did the work. After the second agreement was signed, after the 93 days and the extended corridor and the shared communication channel, Keller walked back to the base in the late afternoon of a day that was turning cold, the sky going from the thin blue of autumn to something deeper and more significant at the edges, the kind of sky that precedes a weather change. He was thinking about the Eastern Corridor boundary adjustment and whether the 20-kilometer concession was the right margin or whether 40 would have been achievable. He thought about it for about 4 minutes and concluded 20 was right. 40 would have been asking for something she would have had to fight her own command for, and there was no value in pushing Kethsalon into a fight with her command when her command was already in the process of deciding they didn't have a good model for the humans and needed more data. You got what you got. You worked with what you had. The 20 was enough. It was done. He found Cortez waiting outside the entrance. I heard it went well, Cortez said. 93 days, Keller said. Extended corridor. Direct communication channel between patrol commanders. He paused. It went better than well. Cortez looked at him. He had the expression he sometimes had, a kind of careful attention, the expression of someone watching something closely, because they're still processing what they're looking at and they know they'll need the data later. She mentioned me, Cortez said. The Veth commander, Vane told me. She said you did good work, Keller said. Cortez was quiet for a long moment. The cold was settling in, the sky shifting, and somewhere above the valley the weather was assembling itself for the change. He looked at Keller's face, the same direct look he had given it in the medical tent, the look of someone accounting for a thing honestly. I worked around the calibration, he said. The foam set wrong. I've thought about it every day since. I know, Keller said. You knew? I can see it, Keller said simply. I'm not blaming you. I'm the commander of a Veth garrison, 30 years of service. Specifically noted that the work kept the person operational. That's the record. He looked at Cortez. You can add the calibration error to the record too if you want. But that's what the record contains. Cortez exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhalation. It was the kind that is mostly about letting something go. Okay, Keller agreed. They went inside. The weather changed overnight. Rain heavy and cold, sheeting down on the valley and the base and the ridge where the Veth garrison held its position. In the morning, everything was wet and bright, the world having been rinsed into a different configuration. The valley and the rain was still itself. The fields, the evacuation routes, the distant shapes of the remaining settlements, all of it sitting in the new clarity of weather-washed light. The work continued. The days counted down. The civilians left in their convoys, and the supply materiel came in through the corridor, and the patrols moved on their routes, and somewhere on the far ridge, a garrison that had laughed at a man with a ruined face was revising its understanding of what it had seen. And in the valley between them, neither occupied, neither abandoned, 11,000 people were moving towards safety one household at a time, carrying what they could carry, leaving what they could not, doing the ancient and difficult work of getting out of the way of forces larger than themselves. They would return. Most of them. That was the plan, the eventual plan. The valley as a buffer not forever, but until the greater conflict resolved itself or changed its shape, and then a return, a settlement, the fields planted again. Distant, maybe. Uncertain, certainly. But possible. Possible because 63 days ago, a man had walked across a clearing with his damaged face tilted up into the dawn and stood there while something that didn't understand him tried to figure out what he was and had let it take as long as it needed and had been exactly what he was when it was done looking. That was the work. That was all of it. There is a Veth word, untranslatable in any direct sense, that appears in Kethsalan's personal journal 11 times over the 93 days of the buffer period. The expeditionary intelligence teams acquired the journal as part of a broader signals collection effort, and the translation of it became, in the years that followed, something of a minor cultural study in its own right, not because the tactical content was significant, but because of the word. The nearest rendering the translation team could produce was the quality of a thing that remains itself under pressure, not stubbornness, which implies resistance, not resilience, which implies recovery, something between them, the specific, observable property of something that encounters force and does not change its essential character in response. A tree that bends in wind but holds its root, a mountain that weathers and remains a mountain. The word appears for the first time in the entry for the day of the first negotiation. It appears again after day 19, the near incident with the patrols. It appears a third time after Keth Salan received Vane's formal inquiry about the convoy route, the quiet procedural note that said, "We noticed. We are watching. We are not letting this go unnamed." It appears in the entry for the second negotiation, and in the entry for the day she learned the evacuation was complete, and in the entry for the permanent structure's completion and the first renewal discussions. The final appearance of the word is in an entry that does not correspond to any particular operational event. It is a reflection, the kind that generals write in personal journals when they are trying to locate the lesson of a thing that has already happened and will go on, shaping what happens next. She writes, "The humans have a quality that I have not previously encountered in an adversary. It is not strength in the conventional sense. It is not cleverness, though they are clever. It is not courage, though they are courageous. It is the specific quality of beings who have learned through a very long and apparently very difficult history to continue, to persist in the direction of the work, to look at what is and say, this is where I start, not where I finish, not what defeats me, where I start." She writes, "I am still learning what this means. I believe it will take a long time to fully understand. I believe it is the most important thing I have ever been asked to understand." She writes, at the end of that entry, the soldier's face has healed further. It is less irregular than it was. It is still visibly damaged. He continues to carry it without concealment, without emphasis, without making of it anything other than what it is. Evidence of something he survived, and starting point for everything that followed. That is their word for it. That is their face. 3 years later, Mace Keller sat in the permanent facility in the center of the valley and drank Veth herbal liquid from a cup, and it no longer tasted foreign. It tasted like itself. The valley had changed. The farmers had been back for 2 growing seasons. The fields were visible from the facility's main window, rows of something low and yellow-green, that the local farmers called by a name that the translation teams rendered as deep grain, a crop well suited to the valley's soil and unremarkable to look at but capable, when processed correctly, of providing nutrition sufficient to sustain a community through a hard winter. The irrigation channels had been repaired. New structures had been built alongside the old ones, modest and functional, the architecture of people who intend to stay. The war was not over. It was a war. Wars did not end on the schedule that the people fighting them would prefer. But in this sector, in this valley, in the framework that had been constructed out of one ruined face and one mirror and one mourning, when something looked at something else and found it did not have a model for what it was seeing, in this specific piece of the larger machinery, things were different than they had been. Not resolved. Not simple. But different. Keth Salan arrived with her composure and her precision, and the shed fragment of her youngest offspring's carapace, which she had begun somewhere in the second year to bring to their meetings. Not displayed, not referenced, just present. A private thing made present, the way private things sometimes are between people who have been working together long enough to have developed their own grammar for the unsaid. She sat. She oriented her optical clusters toward him. The northern access roads, she said. The northern access roads, he agreed. They worked. Outside the valley went about the serious and unremarkable business of being a valley, deep grain growing in the rows, children running the paths between the structures, a dog moving along the irrigation channel for reasons known only to itself, the ordinary texture of a place that had been emptied and had come back and was in the process of remembering what it was. Keller's face was in the window's reflection when the angle was right, a flicker of him, asymmetrical, present, working. He noted it the way he noted anything real and went on with the work. And there was a lot of work, and it was to take as long as it took, and that was fine. That was always fine. The deep grain moved in a light wind off the ridge. The patrol lights moved on their routes. The work continued.